I was 83 years old when I decided to go to Japan. 60 years had passed since that day in the Pacific. 60 years of carrying him with me, of waking up some mornings and thinking about the zero before I thought about anything else, of living a life that was full and meaningful and mine, but was never, not for a single day, free from his presence. My wife Helen had died 3 years earlier. Cancer, quick and merciless, taking her in 6 months from diagnosis to funeral. We'd been married for 54 years. She'd known about the Japanese pilot. I'd told her early on during one of those late-night conversations when you're still deciding whether to trust someone with the darkest parts of yourself. She'd listened without judgment, without trying to fix me, without suggesting I needed to move on or let go or any of the other useless advice people give when they don't understand. She'd just said that we all carry ghosts. And mine seemed like a decent traveling companion as far as ghosts went. After she died, the house felt too big, too quiet, too full of her absence and too empty of her presence. Our daughters, Lisa and Margaret, both grown with families of their own, wanted me to move closer to one of them, suggested assisted living, senior communities, places where I wouldn't be alone. I told them I was fine. I'd been taking care of myself for 8 decades and wasn't ready to stop yet. But the truth was, I wasn't fine. I was unmoored. The anchor that had kept me grounded for more than half a century was gone, and without it, I found myself drifting back to old questions, old obsessions, old ghosts I'd learned to live with, but never fully left behind. I started thinking about the pilot again, more than usual, started wondering what had happened to his body, whether it was still down there in the wreckage, whether anyone in Japan had mourned him, whether his name was on a memorial somewhere, or if he'd been forgotten entirely. Started wondering if I could find out. And then one morning in October of 2007, I woke up and realized I had enough money saved, enough time left, enough reasons to go, and no good reasons not to. So I booked a flight to Tokyo. My daughters thought I was crazy. Lisa called it a wild goose chase. Margaret worried I was having some kind of grief-induced breakdown. They both tried to talk me out of it, pointed out I was 83, that I'd never traveled internationally, that Japan was halfway around the world, and what did I expect to find after 6 decades anyway? I told them I didn't expect to find anything. I just needed to go. They didn't understand. How could they? I'd never told them the whole story, never explained the depth of the obsession, the years of studying Japanese, the notebooks full of letters to a dead man. They knew I'd been a gunner on a destroyer, knew I'd seen combat, knew the war had affected me the way it affected all veterans, but they didn't know about him, about the specific him who'd lived in my head for 60 years. Lisa came with me to the airport, walked me to security, hugged me hard, made me promise to call when I landed. She was crying a little, told me to be careful, to take my medications, to remember I wasn't 21 anymore. I promised, kissed her forehead, told her I loved her. Then I went through security and boarded a plane to a country I'd once helped fight against, looking for a man I'd never met who'd been dead longer than my daughters had been alive. The flight was 14 hours. I didn't sleep, just sat in my seat watching movies I didn't follow, eating food I didn't taste, feeling the plane carry me across the Pacific Ocean I'd crossed once before on a destroyer when I'd been young and terrified and convinced I understood how the world worked. I thought about that younger version of myself, 20 years old, freshly trained, standing at a gun with his hands steady and his heart racing. Thought about how simple it had seemed back then. Us and them, good and evil, victory or death. Thought about how wrong that simplicity had been. The man I was looking for hadn't been evil, hadn't been a monster. He'd been a young man like me, caught up in forces larger than himself, doing what he'd been trained to do, trying to survive or fulfill his duty or achieve honor or whatever complex mixture of motives had put him in that cockpit on that day. And in the final seconds, something had changed. He'd pulled up, climbed, rolled, fallen. Why? 60 years later, I still didn't know. But maybe, just maybe, going to Japan would give me something. Not answers. I'd stopped expecting those decades ago, but some kind of closure, some kind of peace. Or at least the knowledge that I'd tried everything, that I'd gone as far as a man could go in searching for understanding. The plane descended through clouds and Tokyo appeared below, a sprawling city of lights and concrete and millions of people living their lives completely unaware that somewhere among them was an old American veteran who'd come looking for a ghost. I pressed my hand against the window and thought, I'm here. I made it. Whatever happens next, at least I tried. Tokyo was overwhelming. The noise, the crowds, the rapid-fire Japanese being spoken all around me. It was everything I'd imagined and nothing I was prepared for. I'd studied the language for years, could read it fairly well, but hearing it spoken at full speed by native speakers was entirely different. I caught maybe one word in 5. I'd booked a hotel in a quiet neighborhood, away from the tourist centers. Got a taxi from the airport, showed the driver the address written in Japanese characters I'd copied carefully from the internet. He nodded, pulled into traffic, and drove while I watched the city pass outside the window. Modern buildings, ancient temples, neon signs, and wooden shrines existing side by side. A country that had rebuilt itself after total defeat, that had taken the devastation of war and turned it into one of the most advanced nations on Earth. I wondered what the pilot would think if he could see it. Whether he'd be proud or disappointed or confused. Whether any of what he'd died for had come true, or if it had all been wasted. The hotel was small, clean, efficient. The woman at the front desk spoke English, helped me check in, gave me a key and directions to my room. I thanked her in Japanese, arigato gozaimasu, and she smiled, surprised and pleased. My room was tiny by American standards, but perfectly adequate. A bed, a desk, a window overlooking a narrow street. I set down my suitcase, sat on the bed, and felt the weight of 14 hours of travel and 83 years of life settle into my bones. I'd come halfway around the world. Now what? I pulled out the notebook I'd brought with me. Not one of the old ones from the 1940s, those were still back home in a drawer, but a new one bought specifically for this trip. In it, I'd written everything I knew about that day, the date, the location as precisely as I could determine it from old maps and naval records, the ship we'd been on, the direction the attack had come from. I'd also written a list of places I wanted to visit, war museums, memorial sites, archives that might have records of Japanese pilots killed in November of 1944. It was a long shot. Most records had been destroyed, and even if they hadn't, connecting a specific pilot to a specific plane that had attacked a specific ship was probably impossible. But I had to try. I'd come this far. I couldn't turn back now. The next morning, I took a train to the Yasukuni Shrine. I'd researched it before coming. Knew it was controversial, a place where Japan's war dead were honored, including some who'd been convicted of war crimes. Knew it caused diplomatic tensions with China and Korea. Knew that many Japanese avoided it for political reasons. But I also knew it was where the names of Japanese soldiers, sailors, and pilots who died in the war were enshrined, where families came to remember, where the dead were supposed to rest. If the pilot's name was anywhere, it might be here. The shrine was massive, wide stone paths leading through torii gates painted red and white, gardens meticulously maintained, a museum attached to one side filled with artifacts from Japan's military history. I walked slowly, my knees aching, my back reminding me I was too old to be doing this, but I kept walking, past the gates, through the gardens, up to the main hall where people were bowing, clapping twice, bowing again in the Shinto ritual of prayer. I stood there watching them, young and old, some in business suits, others in casual clothes, some crying, some stone-faced, all of them remembering someone. I didn't know how to pray in a Shinto shrine, didn't know if I had any right to be there, an American veteran who'd fought against the people memorialized here, but I bowed anyway, clapped twice, bowed again, and in the silence of my own head, I said, "If you're here, if your name is on these walls somewhere, I came to tell you something. I came to say I remember. I came to say you mattered. I came to say thank you, even though I don't know if you deserve thanks, even though I don't know what you were thinking, even though I'll never understand. I came to say I saw you too. When I opened my eyes, nothing had changed. The shrine was still there. People were still praying. The world kept turning, but something inside me felt different, lighter, like I'd set down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten it was there. Not all the weight, not even most of it, but enough. Enough to take a breath. Enough to keep going. I spent a week in Tokyo, visited museums, talked to archivists, looked through records that had been translated into English, found casualty lists from various battles, found photographs of young pilots standing beside their planes, smiling the way young men do when they're about to do something dangerous and haven't yet learned to be afraid. I didn't find his name, Didn't find any way to identify which of the thousands of dead pilots might have been the one who'd almost killed me and hadn't. But I found something else. I found an old man in the Yushikan Museum, the military history museum attached to Yisukuni Shrine. He was a volunteer guide, must have been in his late 80s, with thin white hair and hands that shook slightly when he gestured. He spoke English, offered to show me around, asked if I had any questions. I told him I'd been in the Navy during the war, that I'd fought in the Pacific, that I'd been at Lady Gulf. He nodded slowly, told me he'd been a pilot, not a kamikaze. He'd trained for that, had been preparing to volunteer, but the war had ended before his turn came. He'd survived by accident of timing. 3 more weeks, and he would have died like so many others. We stood together in a room filled with artifacts, uniforms, medals, photographs, the physical remnants of a war that had ended 62 years earlier, but still lived in both of us. I asked him what it had been like, training to be a kamikaze, knowing you were going to die. He was quiet for a long time. Then he told me it was like living in a dream. Everything felt unreal. You went through the motions, training, studying, writing farewell letters to your family, but none of it felt connected to your actual life. It was like watching someone else prepare to die, and knowing that someone else was you, but not being able to make it feel true. He said some of the pilots were eager, believed in the glory, the honor, the righteousness of the sacrifice, but most were just scared, just trying to be brave enough to do what was expected of them. I asked if he thought any of them had second thoughts. At the last moment, when death was seconds away, he looked at me with eyes that had seen things I couldn't imagine and said, "All of them, every single one. Because no matter what you believe, no matter how much you've prepared, when the moment comes and you're about to die, every human being wants to live." Then he asked me why I wanted to know. And for the first time in 60 years, I told the whole story to someone who might understand. I told him about the zero that had come at our ship, about firing the gun, watching the plane take hits, counting down the distance, about the moment when it had pulled up instead of crashing, about 60 years of wondering why. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he said he thought the pilot had probably been hit, that most likely my bullets or someone else's had killed him or damaged the plane's controls, and the pull-up had been involuntary. That's what usually happened. But then he said, or maybe he saw you. Maybe in that last second he looked down and saw men on the deck and realized you were real. Not abstractions, not the enemy, just men. And maybe he couldn't do it. He said he'd never know which it was, and I'd never know either. But he said it didn't matter. He said the fact that I'd carried this question for 60 years, that I'd learned Japanese and studied his culture and come all the way to Japan to try to understand, that mattered. That meant something. He said, you honored him, whether he deserved it or not, whether he chose mercy or just died accidentally. You honored his life by remembering it. And that's more than most of the dead get. Then he bowed, a deep, formal bow, and I bowed back. 2 old men who'd been enemies 6 decades ago, bowing to each other in a museum full of ghosts. The old Japanese pilot, his name was Takeshi Yamamoto, gave me coordinates. Not the exact spot where my pilot had gone down. That was impossible to know. The Pacific Ocean doesn't keep records, doesn't mark graves, doesn't care which particular patch of water swallowed which particular man on which particular day. But Yamamoto knew the general area where the attacks had happened. He'd studied the battle extensively, knew the naval charts, knew where the American task force had been positioned on November 19, 1944. He wrote the coordinates on a piece of paper in careful handwriting, the numbers precise and clear. Then he wrote something else beneath them in Japanese characters. When I asked what it said, he told me it was a Buddhist prayer for the dead. He said I should read it when I got there, that it didn't matter if I believed in Buddhism or understood the words, that the act of speaking for the dead was itself a kind of redemption. I folded the paper carefully, put it in my wallet next to a photograph of Helen taken on our 30th anniversary. 2 pieces of paper, 2 people who'd shaped my life. One I'd known for 54 years, one I'd never known at all. Yamamoto asked if I knew how to get to those coordinates. I told him I didn't, told him I'd figure it out. He smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and told me he had a friend, a fisherman who worked out of a small port south of Tokyo. He said if I was serious about going, he'd make a call. I told him I was serious. I'd come 6,000 miles. I wasn't stopping now. The port was called Ito, 2 hours by train from Tokyo, a small fishing town tucked into a bay with mountains rising behind it. The kind of place that probably looked the same now as it had 100 years ago, where the modern world touched lightly and old ways persisted. The fisherman's name was Kenji. He was maybe 60, weathered and compact, with hands that looked like they'd hauled nets every day of his life. He spoke almost no English. I spoke halting Japanese. We communicated mostly through gestures and the occasional word we both understood. Yamamoto had called ahead, explained what I wanted. Kenji had agreed, though when I met him at the dock and tried to pay him, he refused. Shook his head firmly, said something in Japanese I didn't fully catch, but understood the meaning of. This wasn't about money. This was something else, something that transcended transaction. His boat was small, maybe 30 feet, wooden and worn but well maintained, the kind of working vessel that existed for function, not comfort. He gestured for me to climb aboard, helped me over the side when my 83-year-old legs hesitated, settled me on a bench near the stern. Then he fired up the engine, a diesel that coughed and rumbled and filled the air with the smell of fuel and salt, and we headed out into the Pacific Ocean. The water was calm that day, unusual for November, Kenji told me through a combination of words and hand gestures. Usually the ocean was rough this time of year, storms moving through, waves that could swamp a small boat. But today it was nearly flat, just a gentle swell that rocked the boat in a rhythm that reminded me of breathing. We motored for 2 hours. The coastline receded behind us until it was just a dark line on the horizon, then disappeared entirely. There was nothing around us but water and sky, the same endless blue-gray expanse I'd seen from the deck of a destroyer 63 years ago. I sat on that bench and watched the ocean pass. Thought about the last time I'd been out here, surrounded by ships and guns and the constant possibility of death. Thought about how young I'd been then, how convinced I was that I understood what courage meant, what duty meant, what it meant to be a man. I hadn't understood anything. Kenji cut the engine. The sudden silence was startling, just the slap of water against the hull, the cry of a seabird somewhere overhead, the creak of wood settling. He checked his GPS unit, looked at the paper I'd given him with the coordinates, nodded. He said something in Japanese. I caught enough to understand. We're here, close enough anyway, within a few miles of where it happened. I stood up slowly, held on to the side of the boat for balance. My legs were stiff from sitting, my back aching. But I stood, looked out at the water that surrounded us in every direction. Somewhere under this surface, maybe here, maybe a mile in any direction, it didn't matter. The Zero had gone down, had hit the water at high speed, broken apart, sunk. And inside it, strapped into the cockpit, the pilot had gone down with it. Maybe already dead from my bullets or someone else's. Maybe still alive, conscious, drowning as the ocean rushed in and pulled him under. I'd never know which. Would never know if he'd felt pain or fear or relief or nothing at all in those final seconds. But he'd ended here, in this water, under this same sky. And I'd come to meet him, 63 years too late, in the only place I could. I pulled out the piece of paper Yamamoto had given me, unfolded it carefully. The Buddhist prayer was written in beautiful calligraphy, each character perfect and deliberate. I couldn't read it fluently. My Japanese had never gotten that good, and classical Buddhist texts were even harder, but I'd studied enough to parse the meaning, to understand the shape of what it was saying. It was a prayer for peaceful passage, for release from suffering, for the soul to find its way to whatever came next, unencumbered by the pain and confusion of the death that had brought it there. I read it aloud, stumbled over the pronunciation, butchered the tones, probably got half the words wrong. But I read it, spoke those ancient syllables into the wind and the water, offered them to a man whose name I didn't know, whose face I'd never seen, whose death I may or may not have caused. Kenji stood quietly behind me, head bowed, hands folded. When I finished, he said something soft in Japanese, a word I recognized, Amen, or the Buddhist equivalent, Namu Amida Butsu, homage to the Buddha of infinite light. Then there was silence again, just the ocean and the sky, and two old men standing in a small boat in the middle of nowhere, remembering the dead. I thought about what I wanted to say, what I'd come here to say. I'd been thinking about it for weeks, months, years, had rehearsed it in my head 1,000 times. But now that I was here, now that the moment had come, all those rehearsed words felt wrong, insufficient, too small for what I was trying to express. So I said the only thing that felt true. I said, "Thank you. Thank you for pulling up, whether you meant to or not. Thank you for giving me 63 more years of life. Thank you for my wife, my daughters, my grandchildren. Every morning I woke up, and every night I went to sleep, and every ordinary moment in between. Thank you for the weight I've carried, because yes, it was heavy. Yes, it hurt. Yes, there were times I wished I could put it down and walk away. But it also meant I remembered. It meant your death, your life, mattered to someone. It meant you weren't forgotten. And I'm sorry. Sorry I killed you, if I did. Sorry you died so young, with so much life unlived. Sorry the war took you and took me and took so many others and left us all broken in different ways. I'm sorry I couldn't save you. Couldn't stop the war. Couldn't change what happened. But I'm here now. I came. I remembered. I honored you the only way I knew how. And I forgive you for trying to kill me. For putting me through 63 years of questions. For haunting my dreams and my waking hours, and every quiet moment when my mind had nothing else to do but return to that day. I forgive you, and maybe, if there's any justice in the universe, you forgive me too. I don't know how long I stood there. Time stopped meaning anything. Could have been 5 minutes, could have been an hour. The sun moved across the sky, but I didn't notice. The boat rocked gently, but I barely felt it. I was somewhere else. Some place between past and present, between memory and reality, between the 20-year-old gunner I'd been and the 83-year-old man I'd become. I was standing at my gun station watching a zero climb. I was lying in my childhood bed in Kansas, waking from another nightmare. I was sitting in a VA hospital, listening to Douglas talk about a dying Japanese boy. I was learning Japanese characters by lamplight, writing letters to a ghost, standing in Yasukuni Shrine trying to pray in a religion I didn't understand. I was all of those moments at once, all of those versions of myself, collapsed into this single point in time and space, and then I let them go. Not forgot, not erased, not pretended they hadn't happened or didn't matter, just released them, opened my hands and let them drift away like smoke. Like water, like breath. The pilot was dead, had been dead for 63 years, was bones and rust somewhere beneath this boat, part of the ocean now, returned to the elements that had made him. I couldn't bring him back, couldn't know him, couldn't understand what he'd been thinking in those final seconds, couldn't answer the question that had consumed me for most of my life, but I could let him rest. And in letting him rest, maybe I could rest too. Kenji touched my shoulder gently. Said something in Japanese I didn't need to translate. Time to go. I nodded, took one last look at the water, smooth and gray and infinite, keeping its secrets the way oceans always do. Then I sat down on the bench, and Kenji started the engine, and we headed back toward shore. The sun was lower now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. The same colors I'd seen from a destroyer's deck in 1944 when the world had been on fire. And death had seemed like the only certainty, but I wasn't on a destroyer anymore, wasn't 20 years old, wasn't at war. I was an old man on a fishing boat, heading home after making peace with a ghost. And that was enough. When we reached the port, Kenji helped me onto the dock with the same quiet courtesy he'd shown all day. I tried again to pay him. He refused again, more firmly this time, pressed my money back into my hands, said something in Japanese that I caught most of. This was an honor, not a job. Then he bowed, deep and formal, the kind of bow that carries weight, that means something. I bowed back, not as deep, my back wouldn't allow it, but with the same intention, the same respect. Two men acknowledging something important had happened, something sacred in its way. Then Kenji untied his boat and motored away, back out to whatever work needed doing, leaving me standing on the dock in the fading light, feeling lighter than I had in 63 years. I took the train back to Tokyo, checked out of my hotel, flew home, 14 hours in the air retracing the path I'd taken a week earlier, but everything was different now. I wasn't searching anymore, wasn't carrying questions that had no answers, wasn't haunted by a ghost who'd been waiting 63 years for someone to remember him. I'd remembered, I'd honored, I'd let go. And now I was going home. Lisa picked me up at the airport, asked how it went, asked if I'd found what I was looking for. I told her yes, I'd found it. She asked what it was. I couldn't explain, didn't try, just smiled and told her I'd tell her someday when the words were ready. She let it go, drove me home, helped me carry my suitcase into the house that was too big and too quiet, but was mine. After she left, I sat in the living room where Helen and I had sat for 54 years, looked at the photographs on the wall, our wedding, our daughters as children, grandchildren I'd lived to see because a Japanese pilot had pulled up instead of crashing. And for the first time in 63 years, I thought about him and didn't feel the familiar ache, didn't feel the weight, didn't feel the gnawing need to understand. I just felt gratitude, gratitude that he'd existed, gratitude that our lives had intersected in that one impossible moment, gratitude that his death had given me life and that I'd lived it well enough to honor the gift. I closed my eyes, took a breath, let it out slowly, and I whispered, "Rest now, both of us. We've carried this long enough." My grandson is still sitting in the chair beside my hospital bed. He hasn't moved in what must be hours. His phone is dark on his lap, forgotten. His eyes are red. He's been crying, though he tried to hide it. Boys his age think crying makes them weak. I know better now. Took me 80 years to learn it, but I know. The nurses have come and gone twice, checking monitors, adjusting IV lines, speaking in soft voices they think I can't hear, talking about comfort measures, about making sure I'm not in pain, about how it won't be long now. They're right. I can feel it. Not pain exactly, just a kind of heaviness, a pulling down, like gravity has gotten stronger and is slowly reclaiming the parts of me it lent out 93 years ago. My lungs don't want to work anymore. My heart is tired of beating. The machinery is shutting down, one system at a time. I'm not afraid. That's the strange thing. I thought I would be. Thought when this moment came I'd panic, fight it, rage against the dying of the light the way the poets say you're supposed to. But I don't want to fight. I'm tired. I've lived long enough, done enough, seen enough, carried enough, and I'm ready to put it down. My grandson, Michael, named after my father who died when Michael was just a baby, finally speaks. His voice is rough, like he's been holding something back for too long and it's finally breaking through. He asks if I ever told anyone else. The whole story, the way I just told him. I tell him no, not like this. Not all of it at once, start to finish. Every detail. I'd told pieces over the years. Told Helen about the nightmares. Told the VA counselor about the guilt. Told my daughters I'd been in combat but spared them the specifics. Told the man at Yasukuni Shrine about the zero pulling up. But I'd never told anyone the complete story. Never connected all the pieces. Never laid it out as a single continuous narrative. Never made anyone else carry the weight of it the way I've carried it. Until now. Until him. He asks why. Why me? Why now? I tell him because he's young enough to understand, but old enough to remember, because he's got his whole life ahead of him, and he needs to know that life is complicated, that people are complicated, that the world doesn't divide neatly into good and evil, no matter how much we want it to. I tell him because I'm dying, and if I don't tell someone now, the story dies with me. And I can't let that happen. Can't let the Japanese pilot disappear completely. Can't let those 63 years of carrying him be for nothing. He has to live now, in memory, in the story I just told, in Michael's mind, in his telling of it someday to his own children or grandchildren. That's the only immortality any of us get, the stories people tell about us after we're gone. Michael nods slowly, wipes his eyes with the back of his hand, asks if I think the pilot was a good man or a bad man. I smile, can't help it. That's exactly the wrong question, but it's the question everyone asks. The question I spent decades asking myself. I tell him I don't know. Tell him I don't think it matters. Tell him the pilot was just a man, young, scared, caught up in something bigger than himself, trying to do what he thought was right, or what he'd been told was right, or maybe just trying to survive like everyone else in that war. I tell him good and bad are words we use to make the world simple, but the world isn't simple. It's messy and contradictory and full of people doing terrible things for complicated reasons and sometimes doing kind things by accident or doing cruel things while thinking they're being noble. I tell him the pilot tried to kill me. That's a fact. And I probably killed him. That's another fact. And we were both just boys. barely older than Michael is now, standing on opposite sides of a war neither of us had started, both of us terrified, both of us trying not to die. And at the last second, something changed. He pulled up. Maybe it was mercy. Maybe it was mechanical failure. Maybe it was the bullets I put in him. I'll never know. But I got to live. Got 63 more years that he didn't get. Met a woman I loved, had children, watched them grow, held grandchildren, saw the world change in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was 20 years old on that ship. And he didn't get any of that. He got the ocean, got to be bones and rust in a question that haunted an old man for most of his life. That's not fair. It's not just. It's not anything except what happened. And I've spent 63 years trying to honor that, trying to make his death mean something by living well, by remembering, by carrying him with me until I couldn't carry him anymore and had to go to Japan and say goodbye. Michael is quiet for a long time. Then he asks if I ever found out his name, the pilot's name. I tell him no, never did, probably never will. The records are gone or scattered or buried in archives I'll never see. And that's all right. He's not a name to me. He's a moment, a choice or a failure or an accident that gave me a life. That's enough. That has to be enough. The room is darker now. The sun has set. Through the window, I can see stars starting to appear. The same stars that hung over Kansas when I was a boy, over the Pacific when I was at war, over Japan when I went looking for answers I never found. I'm getting tired. Can feel the heaviness pulling harder, the edges of the world getting softer, less defined. Not scary, just different, like falling asleep after a very long day. Michael leans forward, takes my hand. His grip is strong, warm, alive. Everything I'm not anymore. He asks if I'm afraid. I tell him no. Tell him I'm ready. Tell him I've done what I came to do. Lived the life I was given, carried the weight I needed to carry, put it down when it was time. I tell him the only thing I'm afraid of is being forgotten. Not me specifically. I don't need statues or monuments or my name in history books. But I'm afraid the pilot will be forgotten. Afraid this story will disappear. Afraid no one will remember that once, in the middle of a war, two young men stood at the edge of death, and something happened, mercy or accident or fate, that let one of them live. Michael squeezes my hand, tells me he'll remember, tells me he'll tell the story. Tells me the pilot won't be forgotten as long as Michael's alive to remember him. I believe him. He's a good boy, a good man. He'll keep his word. That's all I needed to hear. I close my eyes, just for a moment, just to rest. And I'm back on the ship, standing at my gun. The alarm is sounding, the zero is coming, and I'm 20 years old again with steady hands and a racing heart and no idea what's about to happen. The plane climbs, rolls, falls. And this time, when it passes overhead, I see him clearly. Not his face. That was always hidden, always unknowable. But something else. Something that doesn't need a face to be real. I see his fear, his courage, his confusion, his humanity. And he sees mine. We're not enemies in that moment. Not American and Japanese. Not gunner and pilot. Just two souls briefly intersecting, each carrying the other forward into whatever comes next. The zero hits the water, disappears, and I keep standing there, at my gun, at my post, alive because of him, or despite him, or with him. It doesn't matter which anymore. What matters is that it happened, that we were both there, that neither of us will ever be alone because we saw each other, really saw each other, in the space between life and death. When I open my eyes again, if I open them again, I'm not sure anymore. The boundaries between dreaming and waking have gotten thin. I see him. Not the pilot. Not exactly. But something like him. A presence. A shimmer in the air beside my bed. Neither solid nor transparent. Neither here nor gone. I'm not surprised. I've been waiting for this. Knew it would come eventually. 63 years is a long time to carry someone. Long enough that they become part of you. Long enough that when you die, maybe they're there to meet you. He doesn't speak, can't speak, isn't real in any way that would make sense to anyone else in this room. But he's real to me. Real as anything has ever been. I tell him, aloud or in my head, I don't know, that I'm sorry it took so long. Sorry I couldn't save him. Sorry the war took us both, in different ways, and broke us, in different ways, and left us haunted. But I tell him thank you too, for the life. for the question, for giving me something to carry that made me think, made me search, made me grow into someone I wouldn't have been without him. And I tell him I'm ready now, ready to put it down, ready to rest. And if there's anything after this, any heaven or hell or reincarnation or oblivion or whatever comes next, I hope he's there. Hope we meet. Hope I finally get to see his face, hear his voice, know his name. Hope I get to say all of this to him properly, not to a ghost or a memory or a shimmer in the air, but to the actual man, whoever he was, whatever he believed, whatever he felt in those final seconds before the ocean took him. And maybe, just maybe, he'll tell me why. Or maybe he won't. Maybe we'll just stand there, two old soldiers from a war that's been over for 80 years, looking at each other across the distance we never crossed in life, and we'll understand without words that some questions don't need answers. Some questions are just how we love the dead. Michael's voice brings me back, barely. I'm so far away now, so close to the edge, but I hear him. He's crying, telling me he loves me, telling me it's okay to go, telling me I did good, lived well, was a good grandfather. I want to tell him he's a good grandson, want to tell him to be kind, to be brave, to remember that the world is complicated and that's okay, that it's supposed to be. Want to tell him to look for the moments when enemies become humans, to hold on to those moments, to build a life around them. Want to tell him so many things, but I'm too tired. The words won't come. The machinery is shutting down. Gravity is winning. So I just squeeze his hand, once, gently, hoping he understands that this is goodbye, and thank you, and I love you all at once. And then I let go, not just of his hand, of everything. The room, the bed, the machines, the story, the question, the weight I've carried for 93 years. I let it all go. And I rise, or fall, or drift. I don't know which. Maybe they're all the same thing. But somewhere in the space between the last breath and whatever comes after, I feel lighter than I've felt since I was a boy in Kansas before the war, before the ship, before the zero, before everything that made me into the man I became. And in that lightness, I hear something, a voice, quiet, clear, speaking Japanese in an accent I would have recognized anywhere if I'd ever heard it in life. It says, "I saw you." And I say, "I saw you too." And that's where the story ends. Or maybe where it begins. Michael sits in his college dorm room, laptop open, recording software running. He's been working on this for months, writing, rewriting, practicing, getting it right, because he made a promise. And he keeps his promises. He clicks record, takes a breath, and begins. This is the story of my grandfather, Jack Henderson, who fought in World War II. And this is the story of a Japanese pilot whose name I'll never know, who almost killed my grandfather but didn't, and who haunted him for 63 years afterward. The story lives, the pilot lives, and two young men from opposite sides of a war that ended 80 years ago are remembered, not as heroes or villains, not as good or evil, just as human beings who saw each other, really saw each other, in the space between life and death. And isn't that worth remembering? Isn't that, in the end, what all of us want? To be seen, to be remembered, to matter.